Sarah Voss had worn her best dress to the ceremony. It was not much of a dress by most standards. Pale gray, simple, sewn by her mother from fabric that had been washed so many times, it had gone soft at the seams. But her mother had stayed up 2 nights to finish it, and Sarah had pressed it carefully that morning, and when she looked in the mirror before leaving, she had allowed herself one small, quiet moment of hope. She should not have. The great hall of Ashenvale was full when she arrived. 300 people, maybe more. Warriors in their dress coats, elders at their long table, nobles with their careful eyes and practiced expressions. Candles burned in the iron chandeliers overhead, throwing warm light across the stone floor. Someone had laid fresh pine along the aisle. The whole hall smelled like winter and cedar. Sarah walked to the center of the room and stood where she had been told to stand. She kept her hands at her sides and her chin level. She had been practicing that, keeping her chin level. It helped when she was afraid. She was very afraid. Alpha King Kalen Drave stood on the raised platform at the far end of the hall. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with dark hair, and the kind of face that looked like it had been built for difficult decisions. He wore the crown of 7 rivers, which was not actually a crown, but a band of dark iron set with river stones, one for each of the original northern packs. He had earned it at 26. He was now 31, and in those 5 years he had united 4 warring territories, settled 2 blood disputes without losing a single soldier, and built the kind of reputation that made other leaders nervous. He looked at Sarah, and she felt the bond, that pull, deep in her chest, warm and certain as sunlight. She had felt it the first time 6 months ago, when he had walked through the market square and passed within 3 feet of her, and she had nearly dropped the bread she was carrying. She had felt it every day since, quiet and constant, like a second heartbeat. She waited for him to feel it too. She could see in his face the moment it reached him, a small tightening around the eyes, a barely visible tension in his jaw. He looked away from her. Then he looked back, and his expression had closed over like ice forming on water. "I, Kalen Drave, Alpha King of the Northern Packs," he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the hall with the ease of someone who had never once doubted whether he would be heard. "Reject you, Sarah Voss, as my fated mate. You are not fit to stand beside me. You are not fit to carry this bloodline. The bond is severed, by my will and by my word." The hall was silent. Sarah felt it hit her. There was no other way to describe it. It was not like pain exactly. It was more like something being removed, like a hand reaching into her chest and pulling out something warm that she had not known was there until it was gone. Her knees wanted to give way. She did not let them. She pressed her feet to the cold stone floor and stood very still. No one in the crowd gasped. No one stepped forward. 300 people watched her absorb the worst thing that can happen to a bonded wolf, a public severance, spoken aloud before witnesses, recorded and final, and they said nothing, because they had expected it, because she was the daughter of a disgraced Omega, and he was the Alpha King, and everyone in the room had already done the calculation and arrived at the same answer. She did not cry, she did not speak. She turned and walked toward the great doors, and the crowd parted for her, in the way people part for something they do not want to touch, and she kept her chin level all the way to the threshold. The doors closed behind her. Outside, the night was cold and very dark. Sarah walked without knowing where she was going, and after a while she found herself at the northern edge of the territory, at the old stone boundary markers where the pack's land met the wild. The markers were ancient, cracked and weathered and leaning slightly, kept in place more by habit than by anything structural. No one came here anymore. There was no reason to. She sat down on the ground with her back against the largest stone, and her arms wrapped around her knees, and she let herself feel everything she had not let herself feel in the hall. It was not a clean feeling. It moved through her in waves, grief and anger, and underneath both of them something strange that she could not name, something that felt almost like recognition, as if some part of her had been waiting for exactly this, had known it was coming, and had already begun to prepare. She stayed there for a long time. Inside the hall, an old woman left her seat at the elders' table. Elder Marin was 81 years old, had been keeper of records for 53 of those years, and had seen things in that time that most people would not believe if she told them. She had watched the rejection from the end of the long table, and she had felt something she had not felt in decades. A pressure in the air, like the moment before a storm, electric and certain. She had seen rejections before. She had never felt one like this. She left quietly and went to the archive room beneath the East Tower, where the oldest records were kept. Around the same time, a monk named Brother Oren, who had come to Ashenvale from the Order of the Silver Moon specifically to attend the ceremony, slipped out through a side door. He was a thin, careful man, with the habit of noticing things others missed. What he had noticed, standing at the back of the hall, was that when Sarah Voss turned to walk out, the torches along the aisle had flared, just for a second, just for a breath, burning white instead of gold. He had recognized it immediately. He had read about it. He had never thought he would see it in his lifetime. He went to find Elder Marin, a young scout named Pell, who had grown up with Sarah and considered himself her closest friend in the world, had been stationed outside the hall during the ceremony. He had seen her come through the doors with her chin level and her eyes dry and her hands clasped behind her back, and he had followed her at a careful distance, the way scouts are trained to do, present but not intrusive, close enough to help if needed. He watched her sit against the boundary marker. He watched the ground around her settle in a strange way, like something exhaling. And then, after she had been there nearly an hour, he watched her press both palms flat against the old stone, not leaning on it, not resting, but pressing deliberately, as if she was listening for something, and he watched the deep crack that had run through the center of that marker for as long as he could remember simply close. The stone sealed itself, smooth, whole. Pell stood in the tree line for another long moment, and then he turned and ran back to the hall. In the archive room, Elder Marin had found what she had been looking for, without quite knowing she was looking for it. It was in the third ledger of lineage, in a section so old the ink had turned the color of rust. The passage described a bloodline, not an alpha line, not a warrior line, something older than both. The old texts called it the Warden blood. It traced back to the 7 original wolves who had made the first covenant between the packs and the land they lived on, a binding that was less like a political agreement, and more like a promise made to something ancient and alive. The Warden blood did not produce kings or fighters. It produced something rarer, wolves whose connection to the land was not a matter of rank or power, but of nature, as deep and unchosen as the color of their eyes. The last known carrier had died 200 years ago. Elder Marin read the physical signs listed in the ledger. She read them twice. Then she closed the book and sat with her hands folded on top of it for a long moment, very still, in the way of someone who has just understood something large. Brother Oren found her there. He already had his own source, a passage from the Order's records, which he had memorized long ago. The white flame, it said, could not be produced or imitated. It was the land's recognition, the covenant, acknowledging one of its own. It appeared only in the presence of Warden blood. The two of them looked at each other across the table. "She doesn't know," Elder Marin said. "No," Brother Oren agreed. "He doesn't know either." "No." Marin pressed her lips together. "The order in which we tell them matters very much." They went to find Sarah first. Pell led them to the northern boundary as the sky began to lighten from black to gray. Sarah was still there. She looked up when she heard them coming and said nothing, just watched with the careful, measuring stillness of someone who has already been hurt once tonight and has not yet decided whether to let anyone close enough to hurt her again. Elder Marin sat down on the cold ground beside her. This alone was something. Marin was 81 with a painful hip and did not sit on the ground for anyone. She told Sarah everything. The ledger, the bloodline, what the signs meant, what the sealed stone meant. Sarah listened without interrupting. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. When the elder finished, Sarah was quiet for a while. Then she asked one question. "Does it change what he did?" Marin did not answer immediately. She was an honest woman, and honesty required thought. "It changes what happens next," she said finally. "What he did, that was his choice, made freely, before witnesses. That stands." Sarah nodded slowly. "Then it doesn't change what he did." "No," the elder said, "it doesn't." They walked back as the sun came up, the 4 of them, Sarah and Marin and Oren and Pell, moving through the pale morning light across the frost-touched grass. Word had spread through the pack the way it always did, not through speech exactly, but through something less precise and more reliable, through instinct, through the particular unease that had settled over the hall through the night, without anyone being able to say exactly why. By the time Sarah walked back through the great doors, 14 of the 19 pack elders had already gathered in the hall. They had been drawn by the same wordless pull that had sent Marin to the archives and Oren to his memories. They were standing in loose clusters, talking in low voices, trying to name what they were feeling, and finding the words kept slipping away. They turned when the doors opened. They saw her come in. The first elder knelt without planning to. It was not a decision he could explain later. It simply happened, the way certain things happen that the body understands before the mind catches up. Both knees on the stone, both hands flat on the floor, forehead lowered. The oldest form of acknowledgement, older than any title or ceremony, the one the founders had used before the packs had crowns or halls or iron chandeliers. The second elder knelt, then a third. Sarah stopped in the middle of the hall. She stood very still, her gray dress dusty at the hem, her hair loose from whatever she had pinned it into the night before. She did not look triumphant. She did not look angry. She looked like someone trying to hold very steady in a wind. The remaining elders looked at their colleagues on the ground. They looked at her. They felt the pressure in the air, the same pressure Marin had felt the night before. And now they had a name for it. Not storm, not power, but recognition. The land knowing one of its own. They knelt too. All 19. Kalen Drave heard the commotion and came down from the upper hall with 3 of his captains at his back. He had not slept. He still wore his ceremonial clothes from the night before, which was itself unusual. He was a precise man, careful about appearances. He had spent the night thinking and had arrived at no conclusions he was satisfied with. He stopped at the threshold and took in the scene. 19 elders on their knees. His court standing silent along the walls. Sarah Voss at the center, in the same dress she had worn when he rejected her, looking at him with the same expression she had worn when he rejected her. That quiet, absolute steadiness that he had thought was numbness, and was now, in this light, understanding, was something different entirely. Elder Marin rose and turned to face him. "She carries the warden blood," Marin said, in the tone she used when she was not asking permission. "The covenant has acknowledged her. The land has acknowledged her. This pack will acknowledge her, because it is what the law requires, and because it is right." Kalen said nothing for a moment. He was a man who thought quickly, and his mind was moving fast through the implications, what this meant for the pack, for the territory, for the old agreements that most people had forgotten were still binding. But underneath that, quieter and more insistent, something else was moving too, rearranging itself around a truth he had not had when he made his decision the night before. "I rejected her," he said, not quite a defense, almost a question. "Yes," Marin said, "before 300 witnesses. That stands." He looked at Sarah, she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment, that stretched long enough that the people watching began to feel it in their chests. "What do you want?" he asked her, not the elder, her. Sarah took one breath. When she spoke, her voice was clear and even. "I want my name cleared before this pack. I want my mother's name cleared. I want a formal record entered, that the rejection was made without knowledge of my lineage, and that the council has since established what I am." She paused. "I am not asking for your title or your crown. I am not asking for your apology, because I am not sure an apology from you would mean very much yet." Another pause. "What I want is what was always mine, acknowledgement of what I am. That is all." The hall was quiet in the particular way that large spaces go quiet when everyone in them is holding their breath at the same time. Kalen looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the elders. Then he looked through the eastern window, where the old boundary markers stood at the edge of the territory, and even from here, even at this distance, they looked different than they had yesterday, more solid, more whole, like something had come home to them. He inclined his head. "It will be recorded," he said. It was recorded that morning, in Elder Marin's careful handwriting, in the old covenant language that most of the pack had never heard spoken aloud. It was 3 pages long, It was read to the assembled pack in full. Sarah stood in the hall and listened to every word. When it was finished, she turned and walked out into the morning. She did not know yet what she would do with what she now knew about herself. She had spent 22 years believing she was the least significant person in the least significant family, in a pack that had never thought much of her to begin with. And it would take time, real time, not ceremonial time, to understand what it meant to be something else, something older, something the land itself had chosen to remember. But when she pressed her hand briefly against the outer wall of the hall as she passed it, the old stone hummed under her palm. Warm, steady, knowing. She kept walking. Behind her, in the hall, Kalen Drave stood at the window and watched her go. He was a man who had built his life on certainty, on knowing what the right decision was and making it without hesitation, and he was not accustomed to being wrong. He was not accustomed to this feeling, this particular, uncomfortable weight of a choice that could not be unmade. He watched her until she was out of sight. The elders gathered their records. The pack returned to its work. The morning continued, ordinary and unhurried, the way mornings do regardless of what has happened in them. But something had shifted. Anyone who had been in that hall could feel it, in the air, in the ground underfoot, in the way the light came through the eastern windows and landed differently than it had the day before. A wrong had been recorded, a truth had been spoken. A girl in a gray dress had stood very still when the world came apart and had not let her knees give way. And the land, which remembered everything, had noticed.